makes relationships between Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina very difficult, and these distortion comments quite often come not just from representatives of extreme right-wing parties, maybe even not represented in a parliament. These distortion comments come also from President of the Republic and some ministers, so it's outstanding, difficult issue. It's not enough to actually preserve documentation. Completely other and very important question is actually how to challenge distortion. And this is a very serious matter. So a lot of energy we invested in advocating truth-telling mechanisms. Beside war crimes trials, the most serious effort in which we are still engaged, and are engaged in it since 2006, was advocating regional commission, because we felt that trials are not bringing sufficient healing. Although in our society, not just in Croatia, but in post-Yugoslav countries, people expect a lot from trials. So it's that somehow there is expectation that when the facts will be established in a court of law, this will be like sacrosanct. It's that the questioning will stop overnight. We have already seen that this is not the case. So it is that a very important question for us is how to deal with that and how to confront distortion. Documenta is not dealing only with the issue of crimes committed in the 90s. We actually covered the 20th century. So it's additional problem because what we deal here with is unfinished war, not just of 90s, but also unfinished Second World War and unfinished dealing with political violence during Yugoslav socialism. So we have a lot of work also on Goli Otok as place of imprisoning political prisoners during the period of Yugoslav socialism. And it's that with advocating regional commission, coming back to 90s, I'm sorry to jump from one topic to another, but I would like to say a few more words about the work in which we advocated regional truth commission together with more than 2,000 organizations and individuals from post-Yugoslav countries. We had a large consultation process, how this commission should look like. More than 5,000 participants have taken place. And there was some support from politicians, from presidents, from members of presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina for some short time. When President Josipović of Croatia and President Boris Tadić in Serbia have been leading countries, there was actually understanding how important is to come closer to justice for victims. But then they have been voted out, and this trend have changed, so now there is actually not much interest for RECOM, although I would say that different politicians have different amounts of understanding for justice for victims, so always there are some interlocutors, I would say in all of the countries, but less than 10 years ago. And it's that in last years, especially after joining European Union, we've worked more and more on education, have large programs in exchange of youth, involving many other European members countries and youth from that countries, and put a lot of faith and hope in improving programs of civic education, history education, with field visits, with field education, with education which can be carried out on the places of certain events, disregarding have that been former concentration camps or other places of suffering, or also places of resistance. We really believe that education should be developed in a way which would allow pupils and students to learn about what happened in their town, in neighboring town, in places close to them. Because what is clear to us is that in, for example, Holocaust education, which in our country is additionally complex due to other genocides committed against Serbs and Roma in Second World War, with the layer of political violence during Yugoslav socialism, with the layer of violence and crimes in the 90s, which all somehow needs to be thematized in education, that we learned a lesson that Holocaust education should not mostly be connected to the extermination concentration camps, Nazi concentration camps, far from our country, but should actually mostly deal, keeping in mind Auschwitz and Treblinka, keeping in mind what happened in Mauthausen, but focused on Jasenovac, Slana, Metajna, places of extermination here, and places where crimes have been committed in the 90s, like Vukovar, or many locations in which crimes have been committed after military operation Storm in Croatia. So not to go in all details, but saying that what we are really trying to work on with our colleagues from different countries, unfortunately not so much with Argentina, which we always wish, but never find money for that. It's that, that we really try to localize history and making sure that pupils and students research the violent history on a place where they live, and try to look from that point what they can do to confront distortion, what they can do creatively to confront hate speech, and to contribute to peace building in their surrounding.
Very much, Vesna. That was sort of extrapolating from the very idea that Memoria Abierta is, our open archive. If archive is about collecting documentation, you can see that these archives also want to document themselves and keep this in their archive because nobody else does it. They're driven by a sense of more clarification of what happened in the past and finding documents to prove it, but also the open archive means reaching out, finding people to come to the archive and feel a responsibility to actively put all of what's in the archive into society. So if you've thought of archive more as this neutral repository of information that eventually lets a historian into the reading room, then these archives represent something very different that has much more to do with the mission driven by what they documented and stored in their archive and their belief that society needs to talk about it. So that leads me to our third panelist, Trudy, who has been an archivist for all her life, all her life. But how, I mean, just explain to the audience a little bit what you were involved with, but I was just thinking, because they both gave such vivid and great examples of these specific type of archives, how did you get in touch with this scene of all these archives? How did it cross your path after a more, I would say, classical way of being an archivist?
Well, I'm not all that interesting, but I was working in the Open Society Archives in Budapest, and I was asked if I would go and give advice to the Truth Commission in South Africa on what they should do with their records. And once you do that, then you become known as somebody who does this kind of thing, and it snowballs from there. It's not any.
But you have been with the National Archives and Records Administration of the United States, so you have had a very prestigious and expert career before you landed in Budapest.
Yeah, I don't think you go into consulting on human rights archives unless you have a really good, firm basis and you understand what archives are about. That's what you play upon. What I want to talk a couple of minutes about is archives at risk as I see risks around the world right now. I have spent a lot of time working with the International Council on Archives. That's the big body that is the archives representative to UNESCO. It's made up of national archivists from all over the world.
Just 75 years old.
Just 75 years old today. It also has membership from organizations, schools of archives training, and individuals. And there is a section of it called the section on archives and human rights, and I've been actively involved since that was founded 20 years ago now. And one of the things we do is we try to see where we need to issue statements of concern because we think records are in trouble. And this spring, we've issued 3 statements of concern. I want to tell you a little bit about each of them. One of them is a statement of concern on the records of GAM in Guatemala. GAM is the Organization of Families of the Missing. And out of the conflict in Guatemala in the 70s and 80s, and which ended with a peace agreement in '96, there were still about 40,000 missing. And at the time of the war, Guatemala's population was about 7 million. So you can see what an enormous impact this was. And GAM has, of course, actively pushed, as Documenta does, to try to figure out what has happened to these people. Determining fates is the way to say it. They are now being threatened by lawsuits, by former police officers, former military, who do not want these stories to be uncovered. They are being sued, they are being persecuted, people are leaving the country, and so we issued a statement of concern that this incredible archives could be shut down, could be seized by the government, and we're worried. The second one is Senegal, and you would think that Senegal was the most stable of the West African states for years and years, but they have gone into a period of very violent internal conflict right now, and the conflict is swirling around the institutions physically that house major archives. So we issued a statement of concern on what's going on in Senegal. That statement was issued in conjunction with a number of other archival organizations, the Archivistes Sans Frontières, and others that are aware of the situation in Senegal. The third one that is just in the process of being issued, the draft has gone to colleagues in Sudan. Colleagues in Sudan asked for a statement of concern. One institute that held major scientific records and was an affiliate of UN's UNIDO has burned. And so we know that archives is gone. And fighting is going on around the National Archives and around other major cultural institutions. The colleagues in Sudan asked for a statement of concern. We have drafted it in the International Council on Archives and have sent it to them for agreement that this is what they need. And again, we're concerned not only about the records, but the individuals being targeted as well. So you have 2 issues going on in all these conflicts. So that's one piece of the puzzle. Now let me turn to my second topic, and that is the failure so far of us as the international community to figure out a long-term archival solution to the records of temporary international courts. We have now had the final case done in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. It is finally done. The last of the major indictees from the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was just arrested in South Africa. He will be turned over to Rwanda to try, so it doesn't look like the residual mechanism of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda will actually try him. And that probably brings us pretty close to the end of those cases. The Special Court for Sierra Leone, where I did a lot of work, those records are sitting in The Hague, and with not a permanent solution. The extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia just decided to not prosecute anybody else. They have a 3-year wrap-up timetable started last autumn. The agreement there, because it was a mixed court, Sierra Leone and Cambodia were both courts that had international judges, prosecutors, and investigators, and national ones. So they were hybrid courts, we call them. The agreement was, we thought, in Cambodia, that a complete digital copy of the records of the ECCC would be sent to the UN for management. It looks now like that's not going to happen unless the international community does something. At the moment, the archivist of the UN thinks that all they're going to get is the open records from the court. That's not adequate. What we have in that court is very few trials because the two parties could not agree to try more individuals. And so the record of that court, if you look at the records of the prosecutors, records of the investigators, that's where the record of the Cambodia conflict really lies. And unless we get that preserved, the records will stay in Cambodia, which has, frankly, every reason to make some of them disappear, because they reflect on people who are still in power or have families who are still in power. I'm being very candid, but that's what's going on. Then we have the Lebanon case, which has just closed down out of lack of money, and still sitting is the Kosovo case, which I assume everyone in this room knows well. But we've got 6 of these, okay? We've got 5 in some stage of closure. We've got 1 still alive, but there have been discussions of having a special court for Ukraine. There have been discussions of a special court for Syria, a special court for Sudan. Where are we going? And yet these are enormously controversial and important bodies of records. The Sierra Leone court, where I worked, the principal person they convicted was not Sierra Leonean. It was the president of Liberia, because he was part of the conflict that racked Sierra Leone for years. So the question of Lebanon isn't just Lebanese. It affects all the Middle East. The Cambodia court, yes, it's Cambodian, but it had influence, of course, from Vietnam. These are not really national courts. These really are regional courts. They really are international. And we need to figure out, where are we going to have an archive that takes care of these? And we have not figured it out internationally. Every one of these then is a separate negotiation. Where do we put it? Who takes care of it? How long do they take care of it? What are the access rules? I'm here to tell you the UN is not prepared or staffed to do this. And if you add to that the problems that we're going to see with the independent investigative mechanism, I can't do it, I am, on Syria, and other independent mechanisms that looked at Sri Lanka, or I looked at South Sudan. These are very complicated bodies of records, and we need a trained staff. You can put it within the UN, but you've got to have it as a separate, in my view, institution that takes care of these materials and understands how to deal with the long sort of institutional problems that access to those records have. The kinds of things that Documenta, that Memoria, Abierta are dealing with on a national basis, we as the international community have got to figure it out for these courts. That's my plea.
Thank you very much, Trudy. That was sort of an insight, an in-depth look at what happens to records that haven't yet found an archival organizational roof under which they can be kept and accessed, and that relates to what civic societies do, like Memoria, Abierta, and Documenta, in the sense that these are different ways of addressing injustices of the past. Those were international trials, hybrid trials, so they produce documentation under the legal regimen of what trials demand, and it's not clear what happens to these documents. hand them over to civic society would be fantastic, because everywhere where we talk about, even though if it's a war situation that's more complicated, but there would be accessibility to records if you would hand it over to, let's say, a Rwandan, or here Documenta can have the Croatian part of the tribunal against Yugoslavia, so at least the accessibility question would be solved. But because it's international, too many parties want to determine what to do with it, so there's a stalemate, and it's a very it's actually a dramatic situation, because this information from the trials is very important to also be handed over to society. So I wanted to, if you have a question, just raise your finger, or want to have clarification, because I know there's Martin here.
Yeah, I have one question for you, Trudy. What about the many archives that are not safe in their country of origin also? Because that's also a big issue. That's I personally.
Okay. Thank you, Martin. I think you could have fed that question to me. This is something that Swiss Peace has been working on for a number of years, and I don't know, do you intend to address it, Nicole? Safe haven?
No.
Safe haven, archive at risk, safe haven.
Yeah, I can.
Okay. We all have been concerned about records in country that are in danger. And this is ones that are in danger because of war. It could be because of danger of civil unrest or potential civil unrest. It could be in danger because of repressive regime. And it could be in danger because of climate change and the rising waters that are going to engulf many of our island nations. So Swiss Peace put together a group of experts, and we devised a plan that we call Safe Haven. And it is what should I say? It is a function of Swiss Peace now that if you have a body of records that are in danger in your country, and you want to get at least a copy into a safe place, if you contact Swiss Peace, they will try to help you find a place that will hold that copy. It's called a safe haven. And we've developed a set of criteria. We've developed some model agreements between the sender and the receiver. And we're building a network of institutions who are willing to take those kinds of records. It isn't as simple as it sounds. First of all, you'd have to deal with the politics of it. Many people, for example, would not want records sitting in the United States for all the kinds of reasons you can imagine, and I understand that. But second, we know that many of these records have not been digitized, and so the first question is, can you get money to get these digitized in situ and get the digital copy out? Or are you looking at having to take originals out? And do you have to take originals out because they are not digitized, or because they believe that a digital copy will not be trusted in future litigation that might want to use those documents? And so in some cases, even if it's digitized, a small body of really sensitive documents have to come out in their original format to be protected as evidence in future litigation. What we find, of course, is getting them out of the country is not easy. How do you get them across the border? I'm looking at 3 representatives of governments. You know, would you put them in your diplomatic pouch and send it back to your country so we could pick it up? You know, that takes a certain amount of daring that, you know, we can't expect embassies to do. But then the question becomes, will people be able to put it in their suitcases and haul it across the border? Are they going to get stopped? Can they drive it across a border to a country that is safer? Will they get stopped? What will happen to them if they are found with this material? So we have a mechanism set up to put together needy NGOs, needy individuals, and frankly needy governments, as it may be, with a possible safe haven. But the actual process of getting that documentation out of country is a real stumbling block, and we haven't solved that yet. You want to add anything to that?
That sums it up perfectly. Maybe just one dimension to add.
Nikolai's comes with peace.
Yeah, sorry. Maybe one dimension to add, I think. Increasingly, we're also, concerned about in-country protection, because obviously, I think taking records out of the country and also depositing them with another organization should be a kind of last resort measures. But I think, particularly what we have learned also from Syria, from Sudan and Afghanistan is really that not enough is done to ensure and to prevent those records from being at risk in situations of conflict or civil unrest. So I think a lot of work needs to be done, particularly in the field of archiving, so that if a situation evolves, that these records are that you know what kind of documents you have in the first place, that you have a digital copy somewhere, and that you can move the records relatively fast. And this is unfortunately, even with